Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, sponsored by the Associates for Biblical Research. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. On Digging for Truth, we explore the world of archaeology and its relationship to the Bible. Today, we're continuing our discussion with archaeologist Dr. Titus Kennedy and his book, Unearthing the Bible, 101 Archaeological Discoveries that Bring the Bible to Life. Titus, welcome back to Digging for Truth.
Thanks, Henry. Great to be back here with you.
Hey, it's great to have you back on the show. Now, we want to encourage folks to go back and watch episode 1. If they haven't seen that, they can watch that on our YouTube channel or on WBPH's Vimeo links so they can hear your story about why you became an archaeologist. We ended our last episode talking about Egypt, and we want to talk a little bit more about Egypt because it's obviously of such prime importance in the Old Testament narrative. Talk a little bit about a discovery related to the Pharaoh hardening his heart.
This is one of the more interesting cases of how archaeology illuminates what could be a confusing passage in the Old Testament. So if you read through that narrative, we see Pharaoh hardens his heart, and then we see God hardens Pharaoh's heart, right? But if you look into the Hebrew of that, you see that there's actually two different words that are being used for harden. One is to make heavy, and the other is to strengthen. And so what's going on there? Well, if we look at the ancient Egyptian context of this, it gives us some insight into what was being said and also how Moses is communicating something important, very important principle. In the Egyptian realm of theology and the afterlife, they had this process called the negative confession. And we know that this goes back to at least the beginning of the 18th dynasty. So a little bit prior to the Exodus, it would have been even before Moses was born, that they started using this. The papyrus that I show in the book is from Hugh Nefer, and this one's from about 1300 BC. But like I said, this process was known. So within this process, they had a ceremony that is often called the weighing of the heart. So they would show these two scales. They thought that the deceased would go after dying to this judgment period, and there would be a scale. And on one side of the scale, you would have the person's heart, and on the other side, you would have the feather of truth. Well, in the Egyptian mindset, they believed that every time someone sinned, their heart got heavier and heavier with sin. And so if you had too much sin, it would outweigh the feather of truth, and then you would be denied going into paradise. And so when Moses is talking about how Pharaoh made his own heart heavy, he's telling us that Pharaoh is sinning by rejecting God and rejecting God's commands. And that it has implications and understanding for the Egyptian context too, because they can see clearly what he is saying, that this guy, he's sinning, he's not going to go to the good place in the afterlife.
You know, it was interesting when I read that in there, and I have to confess I had never seen this before, and I was intrigued by it. I knew our audience would be. You know, I was thinking about the feather. The feather almost represents perfection. I mean, how light is a feather, right? I mean, it virtually is weightless. So you
Right.
put any of your sins on the other side of the scale, you lose. So it's really fascinating. It also obviously gives us insight to the eyewitness nature of the Exodus narrative, Titus.
Yeah, it really shows how the author of Exodus was extremely familiar with Egyptian culture and religion, to the point where we could argue that he must have been living there. And of course, in this 18th dynasty time period, that's also a connection that we can see.
Yeah, I think I know a guy who lived in Egypt and might have written the Bible. His name is Moses. And, you know, we know a lot of many scholars, most scholars reject that notion, but here we have the biblical testimony and evidence of an eyewitness account, someone who was there. It's the only way to explain these kind of data points. It's remarkable.
Right. There are many things throughout the Pentateuch that really demonstrate an author who is extremely familiar with Egyptian language and culture and geography and religion.
Yeah.
So that in and of itself is a powerful argument.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we see in Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7, affirming that he was raised in the court and knew all this stuff. So it makes total sense. Now we're going to shift a little bit. We're going to move ahead further now because your book is organized chronologically. So let's go to the story about David and Goliath. And I'll let you pick up a discovery related to Goliath in particular.
Yeah, this is sometimes called the Gath Ostracon or the Goliath Ostracon because of its connection there. So an ostracon is simply a piece of pottery, like a broken piece of pottery, usually flat or somewhat flat, that people would use to write on, sort of like a scratch paper or a durable letter that you're reusing, you're recycling. And the name for this comes from Greek and comes from the process of ostracizing someone from the city-state. So back in classical Greek, they started this practice where people could vote on who they would basically kick out of the city in exile for a period of time by writing their name on a piece of pottery and dropping it off, and then they would tally those up. So that's where we get the term for it. But this Goliath Ostracon or Gath Ostracon, this was found in Gath, thus the name. Okay, so Gath is the city that Goliath is associated with, and it dates to the 10th century BC or the 9th century BC. So it's also about the same time as Goliath. But what's written on here is very interesting because we have two names, and one of these names, linguists would say, is etymologically similar to or equivalent to Goliath. All right, so it's not written in Hebrew, so we're not going to see the exact same letters, but they're saying that this is the name Goliath rendered differently. And so we have the name Goliath in Gath from maybe around the 10th century. That at least tells us that his name, which is pretty unique, it's not something you're going to find Canaan and Israel and so forth, is there, present in the right city at the right time.
Yeah, it could have been, and in theory, it could have been found anywhere. Maybe somebody, living in Israel would have known the story, but we find it in one of the Philistine cities and the one that Goliath came from.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm not going to draw the conclusion that it has to be talking about Goliath in the David story, but again, right. It demonstrates the historical context is correct there in that time of David, in the place Gath with the name Goliath.
Yeah, I think that's a good conclusion and a little wink there. It's tempting to go all the way with the argument, but it does speak into that. And again, it's another piece of evidence that fits the right place and the right time. Well, friends, we're here with Dr. Titus Kennedy talking about his book, Unearthing the Bible, and we'll be right back after this message.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. I'm here with Dr. Titus Kennedy, and we're talking about his book, Unearthing the Bible, 101 Discoveries that Bring the Bible to Life. Now, Titus, we left off in our last segment talking about Goliath, and now we're going to fast forward like 1,000 years here, but we want to get into some New Testament discoveries, and so we encourage people to pick up a copy of your book and to fill in the gaps in between the time. Let's talk about you have 26 discoveries in the book about the New Testament, I should say. So we picked just a handful here to discuss. Let's talk about this discovery in Rome called the Jesus Graffiti, and I'll let you explain what that is.
So this was discovered on the Palatine Hill. That's the area where the emperors typically had their royal palace. And it dates to between about 90 and 200 BC and AD, and that's because of the building in which it was found. That was constructed about 90, and it was burned in a fire around 200. So it's a bit of a range, but that comes from end of the 1st century all the way through the 2nd century. It's still quite early for artifacts associated with Christianity, but this is a carving essentially into a wall. It's graffiti where some Roman polytheists or pagans are mocking and making fun of Christ and of a particular Christian whose name they write on this graffiti. So it's a piece of artwork that shows a cross. It shows somebody on the cross. It shows this person, Jesus, actually with a donkey head because they're trying to mock him. And then it shows a person, a Christian, and he is looking up to the cross, and they have written Alexamenos, that's the name of the guy, of the Christian guy. It says Alexamenos worships his God. So they're making fun of him because they're thinking, look, what is this guy doing? He's worshiping a God that got crucified. How ridiculous is that? Just as Paul said that the crucifixion was a stumbling block to those from the mind of Judaism, and he said that for the Hellenistic mindset that it was foolishness because they just couldn't imagine how a God would be subjected to a penalty that was reserved for non-citizens who committed the worst crimes.
And not only the date range, about 100-year range, we can't be more precise than that based on the archaeological evidence, but it's all the way in Rome. And so that's consistent with the fact that the gospel had gotten all the way to Rome, and clearly this is just a regular person here. We're not talking about like a famous person, just someone who had received the gospel and was being made fun of.
Right. It demonstrates the spread of Christianity. It demonstrates early knowledge of Christianity and of Jesus and the crucifixion. And that, again, like you said, it's just some common person. It's not anybody famous. It's not even talking about one of the apostles. It's just a local guy probably who had become a believer.
Yeah, it's a spiritual lesson to encourage us. You know, Jesus says, if the world hates you, remember it hated me first. And in this depiction, you know, you have a sort of a hatred, a mockery of Jesus. And we put up with that today as Christians in the culture and the world that we live in. Certainly our brothers and sisters who live around the world endure all kinds of mistreatment and persecution. So this reminds us to stay strong in the faith and to cling to Christ, even though there's mockery that will take place until the end of the age. But so that's my little theological commentary there, Titus. But let's shift a little bit to, we're going to talk about Rome again. Let's talk about this altar to the unknown God. I was fascinated by this. I had to include this in our discussion.
All right, so I decided to include this particular artifact because it connects to the story in Acts 17 where Paul is in Athens and he gives an example using an altar to the unknown God to talk about the God that these Greeks in Athens did not know. Now, there was an altar in Athens that was discovered, but this has been lost in time. So in Rome, there's something similar, and it's a dedication basically just to some whatever deity. They don't know who it is, what it is. They even say to a god or goddess. So they're covering their bases, which is exactly how the Greeks were doing it. So the one that I show the picture of in the book, that has a Latin inscription. Now, the one that we're talking about in Acts that Paul is using as an example, that had a Greek inscription. Okay, so they're rendering it a little bit differently, but it's a similar idea. They're trying to cover their bases. Whatever God it is that they have missed in sacrificing to or worshiping, they're going to cover it with that. Now, why is this important? So first of all, it shows that Paul was not just making up some example out of thin air, but that he actually saw an altar in Athens while he was walking around, and he said, this is a great way to segue into my message. I'm going to use that as an example. And so there have been altars written with Greek inscriptions to the unknown gods discovered. Are also supposedly in 1208, the Pope found an altar with the inscription to the unknown god in Athens. I said that one's been lost. But then ancient historians like Pausanias in the 2nd century, he talks about in Athens the altar to the unknown god. And if we keep going back in history, we see that it probably connects to what's called the Cylon affair, where there was this plague in Athens. They were trying to get rid of it. They were sacrificing and offering to every god. They couldn't, so they decided to start making altars and offerings to the unknown god, the one they were missing. So Paul's talking about a real thing. We have evidence that that thing actually existed in the ancient world, and even particularly in Athens.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You know, I was reminded once, I heard a sermon about the particular use of Paul when he's talking about how they're searching and groping to find this unknown God, and the verb there used is to describe the Cyclops from Homer that loses his eyesight. It gets his eye stabbed out. You know, it's sort of like a blind groping in the dark, and they're sort of covering their bases. You know, well, we haven't gotten all these, so let's get this other one over here, just like you said. So it's really rather remarkable in that sense. It puts Paul in that same kind of context. Well, thank you for that, Titus. And now what we're going to do is we're going to continue our discussion of New Testament discoveries in our last segment. We have a couple more that we want to talk about. We want to encourage people to pick up a copy of Titus's book, Unearthing the Bible. And with that, we'll be right back after this message. Don't go away.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host Henry Smith, and I'm here with Dr. Titus Kennedy. We're talking about his book, Unearthing the Bible, 101 Discoveries that Bring the Bible to Life. Now, Titus, we're going to talk about one of my favorite discoveries, the Nazareth Inscription. And I would like you to tell the story about the Nazareth Inscription, why you included it in your book, and what you know about it.
Well, the Nazareth Inscription got that name because supposedly it appeared in Nazareth. It was actually taken to Paris eventually, but when the collector died, he had a note on this work, said that it was acquired from Nazareth, and it come in 1878. But this is a big piece of marble, a marble slab, that has an extensive inscription carved into it in Greek, 22 lines. And this is an edict of the emperor. So what happened is the emperor would have sent a letter to the province, and he would have prescribed this new law and given some details, and then they would have carved that new edict into stone, set it up somewhere in public so people could read it, and then they were updated on the latest law. Now, why does this have anything to do with the New Testament or with the Gospels and Jesus? When this was first discovered and they translated it and scholars began to study it, really they immediately noticed that there was a connection, it seemed, to Jesus and the resurrection story, because this edict prescribes a new penalty, the death penalty, capital punishment, for anyone who breaks into a stone-sealed sepulcher tomb and takes out the body with what it calls wicked intent. So it's a similar type of tomb, or the same type of tomb that Jesus is buried in, one of these sepulcher tombs that's sealed with a big stone. The body is in there, okay, it hasn't been cremated like was common in the Roman world. And they take the body out. They don't actually rob the tomb of tomb treasures and goods, but they take the body out, and there's some intent behind removing the body. But they actually don't get into that. So this recalled for scholars what was going on in Matthew 28 when the Roman soldiers were paid to say that the disciples came and stole the body of Jesus so that they could then spread the resurrection story.
Yeah, that's a great summary. So these tombs that it describes, they're very particular the way that it's in the inscription, if I understand it correctly. Sepulchre sealing tombs. Now that was not a type of tomb throughout the Roman Empire. Am I correct about that?
Right. So the Romans typically buried their dead in cemeteries, and they often cremated bodies and used burial urns. So this is something that is much more common in the context of Judea and Galilee, just like we read in the Gospels, where they had these stone-cut tombs, and then they would seal them up. And of course, first of all, they put the body in there on a bench, and then about a year later, they would collect the bones and put them in the ossuary. So there is a distinction between the typical types of tombs used by Jews, used by Romans.
So, and the wicked intent would probably be the preaching of the resurrection. You stole the body, and now you're pretending that this guy, Jesus, was raised from the dead. That's your intention, to deceive people. Now, there's been a recent study that tries to sort of debunk this connection that we're talking about. Maybe you could give a quick survey of what the study is and why what they say about the Nazareth inscription.
So this study was started with the intent of trying to figure out exactly where the Nazareth inscription originated. Because as I said earlier, it had been acquired and turned up in Paris. It was bought on the antiquities market, as far as we can tell, and supposedly originated in Nazareth. But since it wasn't from an actual archaeological excavation, we don't have what's called the provenance for that. We don't know exactly where it originated in ancient times. So they took a small sample of the marble and it underwent chemical analysis, and then they compared this to the chemical analysis done on marble from many different quarries that were used in ancient times. And the one that they got a very close match for was a quarry that was used during the Roman period on the island of Kos. So the island of Kos is just off of the western coast of Turkey today, actually pretty close to where the mausoleum of Halicarnassus is located.
Okay.
So then the conclusion was of this study that this inscription actually had nothing to do with Nazareth or Jesus, that it was put in Kos and it connected to something that happened in Kos, and they said that this has to do with a person called Nicias of Kos, who was a tyrant of the island and died around 30 BC. And they were saying that Augustus Caesar probably issued this because the people broke into Nicias's tomb and desecrated it and his body in public after his death.
Okay, so that's sort of the skeptical reinterpretation of it. But did they have sepulchre sealing tombs in western Turkey, west of Turkey, on the islands of Greece?
So this wouldn't be the typical type of Greek tomb. That's correct. It fits much better in the context of Judea. Yeah. But there are other issues. Like, first of all, just because the marble comes from a quarry on the island of Kos does not mean that that's actually where the inscription was placed and related to. In fact, basically all of the marble during the time of Jesus was imported because there just aren't local sources around there. Turkey was a major area where it was imported, and in fact, Herod the Great and Herod Agrippa both imported marble from that quarry on the island of Kos. There are inscriptions on the island that talk about Herod the Great and Herod Agrippa. So we shouldn't be surprised actually that the marble came from there.
Yeah.
So just because the marble source there doesn't mean the artifact is from there, relates to that. I mean, if we applied that logic broadly to the Roman Empire, then we would be throwing artifacts to all sorts of places where they didn't connect.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's good pushback against this recent argument. Well, believe it or not, Titus, we've run out of time. I was going to let you talk more, but I can't, so I have to say goodbye, and I want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. We want to encourage people to buy your book. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We loved it. Friends, we just want to encourage you to pick up a copy of Titus's book, which encourages you in your faith, which shows the reliability of the Bible, culminating in the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God. We pray that you're encouraged in this today and that you'll come to know him through faith. Thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth.